Hello again, and welcome to those who have just recently joined. I'm here with Norm Baillie-David at TalentMap for our monthly webinar series. And this month, we're starting the first of two parts around innovative approach for managing professional growth. My name is Liz Stelzer-Hebert. I'm a Senior Account Manager here at TalentMap. And as I mentioned, Norm Baillie-David, SVP of Consulting and Engagement here at TalentMap, will be running through the content and giving you some insight into this topic in particular. And we're focusing primarily on professional growth challenges. So how do we provide ample professional growth opportunities in a variety of different environments? He'll speak to some recommendations in particular, and then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So before I go into any more detail, just a couple of housekeeping items. You'll see that there's an option on the right-hand side of your screen to submit questions. So we do encourage you to do so at any point throughout the presentation, and Norm will be addressing those questions at the end of the session. As well, something to keep in mind is that a recording of today's session will be available on the website in approximately a week's time for those who would like to access an on-demand version of the presentation, as well as download the PowerPoint deck associated with it. So just a quick overview for those of us who don't know us here at TalentMap. We've been around for a little over 15 years now, and we've conducted in excess of 7,000 employee engagement surveys since we've started. So all in all, we're looking at roughly 1 million+ employee surveys since the very beginning. And we generally run approximately 500 or more surveys every year. So, you know, our primary focus, of course, is around employee engagement and measuring employee opinions. You'll see that we've worked with a number of different clients across North America, ranging a number of sectors, a lot of experience around technology and engineering and professional services, a large number of not-for-profit associations, large focus on health sciences and healthcare organizations, as well as financial services, and a number of other organizations, large, medium, and small, across the country and also. So that being said, I am going to turn it over to Norm Baillie-David, and I'll circle back towards the end of the presentation with a couple of notes before signing off. Over to you, Norm.
Thank you very much, Liz. So good afternoon, good morning, everybody, wherever in the continent you might be. The issue around professional growth is one that keeps coming up. In our presentations to leadership, in our engagement surveys, one of the things that's at the same time the most important drivers of engagement, and where organizations, small, medium, and large, all seem to be struggling, is around the whole aspect of professional growth. So what I want to do with you in the next, I would say, 35 to 40 minutes or so, is first of all put a spotlight on what exactly the challenges are and how some organizations are managing those challenges and where they come from historically. Why are we finding ourselves in a situation where managing professional growth and engaging employees through professional growth is becoming increasingly difficult? And then what I'd like to do in this first part of the webinar, and we're going to continue this in a month's time, but in the first part of the webinar, what I want to show you are a number of strategies for, in particular, that organizations that are known for very highly engaged organizations, some of the things that they're experimenting with and trying to address these issues. And some of them are a little bit tried and true, but you'll see some are quite controversial, and like any new idea, is going to be open to a little bit of skepticism and a little bit of challenge. But nonetheless, let's put it out there, let's talk about it, and then we can see for ourselves whether or not some of these things may or may not work in the organizations, in our own organization. But I can tell you before we even get that far, that the things that I'm going to be talking about, at least in this first go-round today, are some things that are working quite well for the organizations that are trying them. So let's first of all talk about the professional growth challenge. Now, when we measure employee engagement, we measure the key, what we call dimensions to engagement. Those are the things that in an organization we have influence over, and all of which have some impact on engagement, but not the same amount. So what you see on the chart here are the different dimensions that have some influence on employee engagement, ranging from compensation, work environment, performance feedback, and you can basically read the list in front of you. Now, the percentages on the right represent the relative importance of those dimensions in explaining how engaged or disengaged employees are. So essentially, if you take employee engagement and you think of it as a pie, so think of it as that apple pie we're all going to have at the cottage on the weekend, and cut a slice of roughly 17%, the biggest slice of the pie, and essentially is going to be professional growth. And that basically means it's the single most important dimension of explaining employee engagement. So the higher I have, the better I feel about my professional growth prospects in my organization, the more likely I am to be engaged. And of course, the converse is true. And of course, that's also the risk. So if I'm not feeling particularly good about my professional growth prospects in my organization, then my engagement is going to suffer more than if I'm not satisfied with some of the things on the bottom of the list, like performance feedback, work-life balance, or compensation. So you can see from our database, and Liz told you a little bit about where that comes from in the previous slides, but from our complete database, you can see that it's clear professional growth is the single most important driver of engagement. We've got to get this one right. This is the one that if we get right, we're going to have a much better time engaging or much easier time engaging our employees. But if we're not getting it right, and many organizations aren't, then we're going to have continuing employee engagement challenges. And of course, those employee engagement challenges result in higher costs to our organization, higher costs of attrition, costs in terms of productivity, and of course, I mean, that's the downside, but the upside is higher engagement also boosts those key things. Absenteeism is better, and productivity is higher, retention is better, and all those good things. Long story short, professional growth, number one, right on the top of this list. So let's talk about what we're actually measuring. We're looking at professional growth. We measure professional growth, and these attitudes have come from extensive qualitative research to determine what people are looking at when they consider their own professional growth, learning, and development in an organization. And there are five constructs here. Essentially, people are looking for challenging work, challenging and interesting work. They want to be challenged. They don't want to be bored. They want to have an opportunity to contribute, to do what they do best to fulfill their potential. They want to have learning and growth opportunities. Most importantly, they want to be able to see that they can progress. Their career aspirations can be achieved at the organization or through the organization. And of course, people want to make a difference. They want to have a positive impact. So when you look at a typical client example, essentially what you see in front of you here are the percentage of folks who agree or even strongly agree for each of these attitudes. And those are the numbers in green. The numbers in blue represent the percentage of employees that are on the fence. So they're neither agree nor disagree with that statement. And of course, the percentages in red are the ones who disagree or even strongly disagree. And you're already way ahead of me, I'm sure, visually by looking at, when we're looking at professional growth, we very clearly see where our Achilles heel lies. I mean, it's not in terms of people making a difference. The large majority of employees feel they make a difference. 2/3 of employees tend to feel that their work is challenging. But as we look at the other three, then we're starting to see those numbers go down. And particularly, we see a minority of people who actually feel that their career can be enhanced or achieved at their organization. And of course, given that level of importance and given the importance of professional growth, we see in this particular example, for this particular client, we see 30%, 3 in 10 people do not believe that their career aspirations can be achieved. And this is quite typical. When we're looking at the benchmark, it's lower than the benchmark. The benchmark would be average around 50% or so. 52%. So, even when we're looking at the benchmark, this is not something that organizations are doing very well. So, of course, that's going to have ramifications on professional growth and how we feel about it. And, of course, we already saw there's going to be subsequent ramifications on engagement. We can look at other information. This particular infographic just shows when we looked at engagement, what are we looking at in terms of attrition? The number one reason why people are leaving, and this is also confirmed in our own exit survey research. The number one reason people leave an organization is not the boss. That's a myth. It's advancement. The boss, sort of, that's the lore, but, the immediate manager does play a role, but the number one reason is the lack of advancement in organizations. So, that's something else to really add on top of this. So when we look at this, why are so many organizations having so much difficulty in doing this? Well, we need to go back a little bit and have a little bit of a history lesson. So bear with me. It's my age talking here. So if we back up a couple of decades, and we see how people progressed in their careers throughout the 70s, 80s, and even into the early 90s. Essentially, when somebody started a career in a specific organization, most people coming out with university degrees expected to join, and most often joined a large corporation or large organization, could have been public sector as well, and then expected that as long as they did well and progressed and learned and performed, that they would have opportunities to grow and in a step ladder sort of fashion. So I would become a supervisor would become a manager would become a director an associate vice president, and so on and so forth. And my career necessarily was assured as long as I did a good job in that organization. Well, of course, the 90s was the beginning of the end of that, and that trend has essentially changed. So, how do we provide professional growth opportunities in a small, flat, or low-growth organization? Well, it's not through that step-ladder approach anymore. Essentially, what's happened is these hierarchical organizations are few and far between, and apart from government and the largest corporations in the country and in the world, we basically have flattened out our organizations. And then when we compound that with a new generation coming into the workforce that in terms of numbers is the second largest influx of and growth in the labor force since the advent of the baby boomers, so I'm talking about the millennials here, you've got a situation where now you've got a lot of talent, but we just don't have the positions to fill all of this, all of the needs for that talent. So I was speaking at a conference yesterday, and basically you take an example, or I took an example of 5 employees, and you usually in those 5 employees, let's say you have 5 employees reporting to you, the typical pattern would be you have 1 star, 3 very, very good employees in the middle, and 1 not so good. So you've only got necessarily, where we used to be able to find positions for 4 of those 5 employees throughout an organization, now we've only got 1. So there's only 1 box in the future where we can slot one of these high talent employees. And the other 3, essentially, are going to go wanting. And of course, that is going to cause for frustration, that's going to cause for disenchantment, of course, that causes for exactly the situation that we see here, where we see more and more people, or fewer and fewer people, being able to achieve that promotion. And of course, when I talk to the smallest organizations, the problem is the most acute. In larger organizations, there tends to be more flexibility, more opportunity, but alas, the issue is that even in the largest organizations, the demand for those promotions is exceeding the supply. The paradigm no longer exists in terms of that unlimited growth. That's not necessarily anybody's fault. It's just, I hate the term, but it applies here. It is what it is in terms of, we don't have enough positions to fill all of that talent coming in. And of course, in the old paradigm, that essentially rewarded certain behaviors, and basically people didn't take risks as opposed to entrepreneurial behaviors as well. So it is changing for the better in some respects. So the traditional career path that we've been talking about for so long, and even what's really clear is we may accept, we may understand, and this might be intuitive and nothing new to you here on the phone on this webinar, but we're still running our performance management practices, we're still running our promotion practices, and most importantly, we're still having the conversations with our employees in the same way we did when this was the case. And that's really where we're having the biggest issue. So what happened essentially throughout these years? Well, we needed to cut costs. We're talking about the 90s, the 2000s. So how do we cut costs? We laid off employees. We need new skills. Well, we hire from the outside. We need the training costs have gone up, so we hire from the outside again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And throughout all of this, what we've seen is you've seen a workforce that has basically observed this happening, and has essentially the social contract that I was talking about between employer and employee, where you do a good job, you get promoted, or that's gone. Essentially, we need a new career paradigm. We need a new way of thinking about career growth, career advancement, because this old paradigm is essentially, it's not going away, it has gone. It has disappeared, but we're still acting as if that hierarchy and those promotion opportunities exist. Interesting, one of the things that we do besides exit and engagement surveys, we do a lot of onboarding work as well. And even in the onboarding work, when we're looking at large organizations, I'm thinking of a large bank, for example. I'm thinking about a large public sector organization as well. In the healthcare field, when we're looking at the #1 reason why new employees come to that organization and were recruited, well, what do you think it is? It's career advancement. That's the #1 reason why someone's attracted to some of these organizations. But in the same onboarding survey approach, when we do it 9 months later, as we track these folks, they already begin to see that those expectations won't be met. So they're thinking and we're recruiting as organizations based on this expectation, which there's just no opportunity for it anymore to be realized. So of course, as expectations dash, you see the outcome that I showed you in the graph before. So what do we have? We've got a winner-take-all economy, and management and ownership of organizations have basically, they've constructed these organizations, but what's happened is you've got widespread disillusionment amongst the rest of the workforce, and that disillusionment, if I just might flip back, is very, very clearly visualized when you do a survey like this and ask that question. So what do we do about it? Is really the key question here. And I mean, there's a lot of literature that exists. What I'm going to be talking about here are a number of ways that we can deal with this situation. But what we have to first realize is it's not, we cannot necessarily go back to the years of where we had, promotions, not unlimited, but certainly enough to make sure that our good people were happy and were staying. That's not the case anymore. We know we don't have enough positions to keep all of the good people, and we certainly don't have enough positions and career advancement to keep these folks engaged for the reasons that I've just been talking about. So then, what are some of the companies, the new companies, the most innovative companies and organizations doing around this particular issue? Well, there's 4 ways that I want to talk about today, and then we're going to, next month, when I do the webinar, we're going to talk about some of the issues around some of the other aspects of professional growth, such as challenging work. But today I want to really focus on the career management and the retention issue, or the lack of retention issue that's caused by it. Well, first of all, we've got something called career management. Now, if you contrast this chart here on the top left, and I go back to something that looks like this, well, the career is very, very different today than it was even 10 years ago. We do not anymore, we no longer have this step-by-step ladder in terms of moving up an organization. What a typical career is looking like is all over the place. It's up, it's down, it's across, it's in, it's out, and it evolves over time, and there's really no pattern to it except for the fact that it is motivated, as it was with the step ladder, it's still motivated by pure self-interest on both sides. It is an economic equation where each party, sort of candidate or employee and employer, are trying to maximize their own benefits and working for themselves. It sounds a little bit craft to say so, but that's essentially what's happening. So it becomes, and it really is and will always be, a business negotiation in terms of how this is managed. And so we cannot blame somebody who's, if they're thwarted in their career and have an opportunity to move elsewhere, are going to be doing it. But factor in, again, I mentioned off the cuff millennials, and factor in largely different expectations in terms of how fast what's going to progress. And also the fact that in our research, we are clearly seeing that millennials as a group, I mean, individual by individual may differ, but as a group, there's no necessarily specific pattern to stay on a vertical track in an organization. And the learning, the growth, the essentially the enhancement of career can come through a number of different formats, and it doesn't necessarily rely on the single organization anymore. And that's why you have such a pattern as this. So what we're talking about in terms of career management, I'll get to in a second. But I want to just touch briefly on the other things that you see on the slide. The big logo for LinkedIn is really about networking and improving professional growth by providing people and encouraging network building in all areas and all aspects of the organization. I'll talk about that. Then there's the alumni network. So the alumni network is something that's been used very, very expeditiously, or I guess used quite a lot by the management consulting organizations. They have realized for a long time the value of a good alumni for a number of reasons. But in other organizations, not related to professional services or professional management consulting, have usually tried to allow their sales and business development and outward-facing people to do networking for that role, but have frowned upon networking or external networking amongst sort of the back office, internally focused employees. And what we're seeing now is that's actually very, very short-sighted. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there's something that's quite controversial that's coming out of Silicon Valley, and it's called a tour of duty. And I'll leave that for a couple of minutes. I think that's the one where we're going to see a lot of rancor and a lot of controversy, but it's working for some. So let's go into these a little bit more detail. So when we're looking at professional growth, what's happening increasingly, and this there's a number of clients in particular. I'm unfortunately unable to mention any by name, but I can talk to specific examples where, and this is also very, very pronounced in the literature on performance management and career management, is that we're moving from a system of performance management, which is really rear view mirror. So if you look at your own performance management frameworks and systems, many of you will have systems where we basically sit an employee down roughly once a year, and we look at how they've conducted themselves, behaved, and performed over the past year, and then we evaluate or comment on that, and then use that usually for compensation and often for promotion or advancement purposes as well. And we go into the dreaded strengths and weaknesses of the individual. And we also, in many cases, provide a numerical or letter rating. We boil down all of the complexities of an individual into a number between 1 and 4 or 1 and 5. And then we're surprised when that individual balks at that for whatever reason. And of course, it's always rear view. We're always looking at what somebody did in the past. What career management is all about is changing the nature and frequency of that conversation, and then beginning to build new frameworks around that. So a number of organizations, I can mention the ones that we've been reading about in public, some of the, again, I point to the big consulting firms, Deloitte and Touche, Deloitte now is one of those where we can read online what they've been doing on this. But basically, the career management paradigm is we sit someone down, first of all, much more frequently. So the annual performance evaluation is gone, and instead, what we're doing is we're instituting a monthly or a quarterly or even monthly conversation with an employee and their manager, and it's not necessarily talking about the past. What did you do in the last month? What did you do in the last quarter? It's talking about where do you need to be in the next quarter? What do we need to do differently or the same? What are the things that you're doing really well as progressing to where you want to go? And of course, the where you want to go part of that conversation needs to be expressed up front. So we're constantly looking forward. Now, one of the problems that everybody knows about in terms of the whole performance conversation is managers dread it. It's not a comfortable conversation to have. We don't like it. It's awkward. We avoid it like the plague. I don't know a single manager in 30 years of working who enjoys doing performance evaluation conversation. So we avoid it. But in doing so, one of the things in terms of career management is we shift the onus to the employee to initiate those conversations. So the employee is the one who basically said, it's time for my monthly chat. It's time for my monthly conversation, my career conversation. And the manager now has an accountability that's instituted in the new framework that says, yes, we have to sit down every month and I have to document that. So, but the employee initiates it because it's in their own self-interest to do so. Always has been. But we've always given the onus to the manager to do this as opposed to the employee. So that's the key. And then there's the nature of the conversation itself. And the nature of the conversation, as I already alluded to, is forward-looking. It's where do you want to be? What do we need to do to help get you there? What are the things that you need to work on? What are the behaviors that you need to change? What are the behaviors that are serving you very, very well that you need to augment and to continue? And where is that end state? And of course, that's continuously evolving. But this digression a little bit into the performance management sphere has essentially comes back to the issue of career aspirations, because when we look at the fact that we don't have enough positions to promote, and if we continue to look backwards in the mirror and essentially allude to or infer that if someone continues or behaves in the way we talked about in the past, that they'll get the promotion in the future, it's just not going to happen. We don't have the position. So by looking forward, we can basically have a much more honest conversation with the employee and say, you know what, John, we don't have the type of position or enough of those positions that you're aspiring to. So instead of making a false promise here, we can go in a particular direction if this is where you want to go, and we can help you develop and train and learn by providing some other options to you. And then, of course, you'll be able to essentially learn, to grow, to develop, and you'll be able to take those skills into the open market. That's not a counsel out conversation, if that's what you're thinking, but it is a conversation that somebody will be much more appreciative of, because they'll say, wow, the organization is really helping me, even though they realize that I might not stay. And then we look at our retention figures, they're going down. The millennials are moving faster and they're moving out faster. So this is something that really helps, if not keep people, because they're not staying anyway, but engage them while they're with us. And that's the key difference in the paradigm. Engage them while they're with us, because eventually they are going to leave. But if we focus on those career aspirations and help develop those, even though they might not be with our own organization, then we'll be engaging those folks for the 2, 3, or 4 years that they've got with us. And of course, when we're doing that on a larger scale, our overall employee engagement is going to go up. Our retention will probably stay the same. It might, with demographics, drop a little bit, but that's what we want to make sure is if the engagement stays the same, then the retention stays at least the same, maybe drops. But let's, before we move on, acknowledge that retention might not be the same in 5 years from now as it is today. And we're probably already feeling that, especially with our younger employees. So, network development is next. And in terms of network development, one of the things that we see in our research, especially in millennials, but not exclusively in terms of millennials, is there's a lot more impetus and interest in working collaboratively, in working in teams, and in connecting with others, and not necessarily others within our organization. And of course, this is enabled by social media. And so what organizations, up to very recently, have been doing on our end is we've been looking at our employees and productivity of employees, and we've been frowning on the use of Facebook on company time. We've been frowning on the fact that an employee or many employees will have a phone sitting beside their computer, and they'll be on both simultaneously. They'll be doing something on their computer, and then they'll be doing something on their phone and texting somebody. But what's actually happening here is the use of social media is essentially the vehicle by which people are connecting with the world outside, and that, in other words, networking. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, they're just chatting with a friend, but chatting with a friend can be just as important to us as an organization as a business conversation, and the two are becoming intertwined. Let me give you a very, very concrete example of that. Happened in our own organization yesterday, as a matter of fact. So we had a new, quote-unquote, millennial person who started 3 months ago in our business development team, and that person was, acted just like I just described. He's got his phone beside him, and he's texting somebody, and he's working on Facebook, and he's working on Salesforce, our internal system, and things like that. And lo and behold, we get a contract from a company out in California. Well, how did that company in California find us here up in Eastern Canada? Well, it turns out that, it's the typical friend of a friend of a friend who used to work for, or another friend who used to work for, who used to use TalentMap as their engagement survey provider and was very pleased. And of course, through the networking, those dots all got connected. So when you look at the power of the network and you expand that to not only sales and business development people, but of course this is back office as well. It's not always necessarily about revenue generation. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It can be around essentially, engineers talking about, about different techniques. It could be about back office people talking about different, better ways of doing things. I'm doing this like this, and I could be doing it like that. So each individual in an organization is the power of its network, I to the power of we. So you essentially, if we facilitate or open this up and allow folks to, use social media, network on the job, they're actually helping us. They're not being less productive in the same way that we've been talking about. So if we as an organization allow our employees to, and allow them to expand based on the power of their networks, then as a company, as an organization, we'll essentially have the power, we'll improve our network exponentially, and this is really what this little formula is talking about. Of course, so network development and LinkedIn is the key conduit, but one of many. Instagram and Facebook and all the social media vehicles are all vehicles and conduits that we as organizations should be promoting, or at least not inhibiting and not prohibiting, thinking that someone's wasting their time working on Facebook or posting something on Instagram where they, in quote unquote, should be working. So encouraging network development is key. I'm going to skip over tours of duty, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. And essentially what I want to do is come back to the issue of retention and its link with professional growth. So we saw at the very beginning that a large number of individuals are not happy with their career aspirations in their organization. We also know that millennials tend to be more mobile than other employees. Or in other age groups at least. So that's putting pressure on retention. And essentially, so even if we institute some of these, if we institute more more learning and development avenues that I'm going to talk about next month. What if they still leave? They're going to leave. We've already established that. So if after all that they still want to leave, well, what do? Well, first thing we do try and change their mind, assuming that this is someone who we value and we want to keep in our company or in our organization. But if that doesn't happen, and 8 times out of 10 it won't, I mean the person has made their decision and they're leaving the organization. The difference now between, let's say, 15, 20 years ago is someone leaving the organization is no longer goodbye. And it doesn't have to be. So we congratulate them. Essentially, we say, we're really happy that you found something, along the lines of what you have been looking for over this time. We're glad to have played a part in the development and in your development. So congratulations to that, because it does reflect well on our organization as well. But then what we do is we welcome to our organization's alumni network. And the alumni network, now, first of all, it's not something essentially that we have to create because it already exists. It exists in the form of our former employees are still in large part in contact with many of our existing employees. People have relationships, people have friendships, and that social media contact is still going on, whether or not the organization is taking advantage. And what we're proposing here, and what many organizations are doing now, and what the management consulting companies have been doing for the longest time, is realizing that the alumni, our former employees, are a huge asset. So let's facilitate that contact. Let's be involved in that contact, and to a certain extent, let's organize or formalize, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So the goal here now is no longer retention; it's lifelong affiliation. So the good employee who has found something better on the outside, they haven't left. Basically, if we can form that alumni network, and it's really easy, you basically put up a web or even LinkedIn profile around that, and then you can facilitate those conversations. You give people a conduit to keep in touch. But most importantly, we have now a window on our former employees, where they are, what they're doing, and not in a nefarious way, in a very friendly and very open and transparent way. But there's 3 ways where this can be of huge benefit. The first one is, of course, to the organization, bottom right here, this is a huge recruiting pool. Our surveys tell us that about 80%, 8 in 10 people who leave an organization are willing to return at some future date. So that's a huge recruiting pool. It's a gold mine, really. So we can exploit that. When we need, those of us in talent acquisition should be looking at this very, very seriously, because often we're doing that sort of ad hoc. So if we got a position to fill, ooh, John left that about 3 months ago. I wonder if he's happy in the position that he went to. A lot of people aren't. And then we're scrambling to find John's contact information. Might be a home email or something like that, but it's very ad hoc. If we've got this alumni platform set up, it's really, really easy. We can also just do a quick posting. That position now has been open. Anybody in our alumni network willing to come back? And you'd be surprised at the response you get. In some cases, it'll also generate revenue, where you've got someone, and this is really what's turned the consulting companies onto this, is they've realized that as their former employees have joined client organizations, then those relationships have solidified, and they can actually drive revenue through that. But most importantly, where we see the key benefit of this on the organization side is the corporate memory has never disappeared. And that's the huge cost of retention. Apart from the talent acquisition of replacing the person, the huge hidden cost of attrition is the retraining and the reestablishing of that corporate memory. And I can tell you very, very clearly in examples here where we have our alumni network. It's just a question of reaching out to, go just LinkedIn Kelly, and Kelly can tell you what happened on that particular file. And Kelly didn't leave didn't leave our organization on bad terms, and Kelly's more than happy to help to hand out. So Kelly could have been in the office next door as opposed to in a new company, but that corporate memory still exists to a large extent. So there's very good benefits. But it's not all about us. It's about the employees as well, and they want to keep tabs for the relationships, for the networking, you know, and that ongoing affiliation is also a CV booster, for example. So if some of you have very strong brands, our former employees like to maintain the association with those brands. So it really is a win-win around this one. And then, so the last one I want to talk about here are tours of duty. Now, tours of duty are quite controversial because what they do is they codify the fact that the mobility of the new generation is becoming increased. So essentially the reasoning goes with the tour of duty is, well, if they're going to leave in 3 to 5 years anyway, why should we enter into a semi-permanent contract? Why don't we put a limit, a time limit on that contract or contract period and reevaluate at the time being? Now, one of the causes of the mobility of the new generation is essentially the fact that, you know, so much fewer permanent positions exist. There's a lot more temporary, there's a lot more contract, there's a lot more part-time, there's a lot more reticence among many organizations to enter into full-time commitments. And at first glance, that's what this looks like as well. But that's not exactly what we're talking about. What we're talking about in this particular case is a renewable contract. So it really sets out the terms, and it sets out a finite time limit to see where somebody should be, and then reevaluates in a good amount of time whether or not that person you know, will be able to achieve one of the few promotions, or in a very early state if we should be starting to develop them to work on the outside. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a less permanent position. What we're talking about is stability in between, and it could be lifelong, but very rarely is it going to be lifelong. So, of course, you're probably thinking, you know, this is just another contract position, and people are going to turn it down. I think it's very, very important to communicate that if you go towards this tour of duty model that a lot of organizations, especially in Silicon Valley, are doing, that it's the same as a permanent position, but it's a reevaluation of status after a finite period of time. And that reevaluation, what it does is really takes the career management focus that we've been talking about and codifies it. So that's what we're talking about in terms of a tour of duty. So those are 4 ways, essentially, to you know, work on the whole aspect of career aspirations. And I think the first step in this is to recognize and acknowledge that the step-ladder career paradigm is dead. We do not have the positions anymore to keep people essentially to engage everybody who deserves that promotion. We have to be straight up with our employees, and only a select few of them will continue on in our organization. Most of them, there won't be the positions for. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. Very large organizations, government can provide a lot of that opportunity as well. But even in those cases, we're seeing that the demand is exceeding the supply at that level. But nonetheless, for most of us, the step-ladder career paradigm is dead, and we have to change the conversation. So how do we do that? How do we keep those folks engaged at the same time as we're saying, well, you know what, the career aspiration, you know, if we're just talking about movement and promotion, you know, that's the probability that you're going to be able to do that with us is not that high. So how do we keep you engaged? Career management, focus on the future, networking, perhaps the tour of duty, and essentially reacting with an alumni network and preparing for the eventuality that, yes, our retention will decrease. Yes, more people will be leaving, but they don't have to leave for life. But in all of these cases, and especially when we're talking about career management, the rewards in terms of higher employee engagement, because we're thinking about their future as opposed to evaluating their past, that higher level of engagement in terms of rewards we're seeing in the organizations that do this are far outweighing the risks. So that's it for today. Before we close, essentially, I'm going to just give you a little preview in terms of what we'll talk about in the next part of this. I've been focused really on the career aspirations and the promotions part of this, but professional growth, as we saw before, has different aspects to it, and we're going to go into some of those in the next month. What's the role of learning and development and training, and what's happening? What are the best practices in terms of learning and development? What are some of the professional development initiatives and programs that people and good organizations are instituting? Now, job shadowing and secondments are probably things you've heard about, but job crafting is something that's relatively new and is quite powerful in terms of helping employees, specifically those who are having issues around challenging work. And of course, we'll get into the whole aspect of training and employee engagement, because we saw learning and development is really, really important. But what we're also seeing is, what's happening, the training in the corporate or organizational environment, and is it really going the way of the dodo? I'll ask that question and answer it in next month's webinar. So before we sign off, I'm just going to have Liz will come back on, talk you through some of the things that are happening in the next few months with TalentMap, and at the same time, I'm going to pop open the questions box and see here if we've got any questions that we can address here while Liz is talking through some of those future events.
Perfect. Thank you, Norm. So a few upcoming activities on the TalentMap side. So as Norm mentioned, be sure to tune in next month on July 28th for the second part of today's webinar on professional growth and employee engagement. Heading into the fall now, into early October, we will be participating in the HR Executive Technology Conference in Chicago. Early November, so the 1st, we will be participating in the People Analytics Summit in Toronto, and then mid-month November, we will be at the Canada's Top Employer Summit at the Four Seasons Hotel in Toronto as well. So I guess in terms of housekeeping, that's about it that we have. I'm going to turn it back to Norm, but before I do, remember that a copy of the webinar will be posted to the website along with a downloadable copy of the PowerPoint accompanying deck. Over to you.
Thank you, Liz. I'm just going to go here. I'll flash that screen so you can see the various contact information, especially you can see where to get those copies of the webinar when they come online in approximately a week. Some very, very good questions have been posted during the webinar. I just want to address a couple of them here. So the first one reads, I like the concept of tour of duty, rehiring employees when you need them. However, with compliance and regulations, it's not that easy. Affordable Care Act, 401k, etc. Any suggestions? What we're talking about in a tour of duty is it's not firing, rehiring. We're never losing the employee. What we're doing is I mean, of course, there's different legal models to do this, but what we're basically saying, and we could do this within the framework of a permanent contract as well, if that's more amenable to the regulations. But the concept here is really to set in very, very clear terms different steps or a finite aspect to the term of employment, to say for a certain period of time, and the ones that are doing this is really around 3, maybe 4 or 5 years, and saying, this is what we're going to do for you, this is what you're going to do for us, and we're going to reevaluate it after that period of time. The contract doesn't, the employment contract per se doesn't necessarily have to come to an end, although different organizations are using different models around that. Another good example, and we hear this one quite a bit, how can you implement tours of duty or renewable contract while having an inventory of permanent employment contracts? Well, that's essentially, it's a gradual process. And I know one international organization with a large complement of employees abroad, essentially are doing this and are integrating this slowly, where they have an inventory of permanent contracts, but as new people come on, they're experimenting with the tour of duty approach. And in many, many cases, they're having good luck with it. So one of the things that I didn't mention that's sort of a side benefit, if you will, on the employer side, is that in a very, very structured, regulated environment, it also provides an avenue where an unsatisfactory employee can be counseled out or dismissed in a much more easy fashion legally speaking. Of course, that's not the objective of what we're talking about, but it is one of the things that are, sticks in the back of some organizations' minds. So basically, you gradually phase it in with new employees. You can't just get rid. And turning perm contracts into tours of duty will create a lot of rancor in the organization and probably subvert the things that you're trying to achieve by doing it. Last question here, what is the relationship between professional growth and corporate culture? Can corporate culture mask some of the effects of lack of professional growth opportunities? Well, corporate culture is very, very broad and essentially touches a lot of different aspects of the organization, professional growth being one of them. So culture, essentially, the way I describe culture is it's the way we do things. And of course, the way we do things touches just about everything in the organization. Can corporate culture mask some of the effects of lack of professional growth? In some cases, I would say it can offset. So if there's, and I'll take the example here of not-for-profits. So some not-for-profits that are very cause-oriented have a very, very strong vision and a very, very compelling altruistic reason and vision for wanting to work at those organizations. We want to do good. So in charitable organizations, we see this quite a bit, where some people are willing to sacrifice long-term or professional growth in the traditional sense, at least the career aspiration side, because they want to continue working and continue contributing to the cause. So in that particular case, it can work. But in other cases, it might not work so well. So it's not something, I think, that we should look at as trying to sort of mask or balance. I mean, at some point, as we saw, professional growth is very, very important to one's level of engagement, and it will be called out. And if we don't, then essentially we'll have one of two things happen. Our engagement will drop and or our retention will increase. So we do have to look at professional growth a little bit separately and not necessarily count on those other aspects of quote-unquote corporate culture to do that. So those are the questions that we've addressed. Thank you very, very much for those. And on that note, with 5 minutes to the top of the hour remaining, I'm just going to thank everybody and wish you all a very, very pleasant rest of your day. So thank you very much, everybody.